Beyond the Books is a podcast from the University of Edinburgh's School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at research and the people who make it happen. I'm Emma Aviet, a PhD student of English literature and current postgraduate web and communications intern. In this episode, I was lucky enough to interview Dr. Emanuela Patti, a lecturer in Italian at the Department of European Languages and Cultures. I had the chance to ask Emanuela about her fascinating career and journey to her current position at the University of Edinburgh, as well as her research, which lies at the intersection of literary, media, and cultural studies. In particular, we discussed the late Pier Paolo Pasolini, who was an Italian poet, filmmaker, writer, and intellectual. We explore the themes and images in his stories and films and reflect on the way they pull from the past, including from the work of Dante Alighieri. Finally, we touch on the idea of electronic literature, spanning from its very beginning in the 1960s to the blogs and fan fiction of today. Emanuela has fascinating ideas on collaboration and appropriation in these art forms, so make sure to give it a listen. Hi, Emanuela. It's so lovely to have you here. Welcome to Beyond the Books.
Thank you, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here too.
Just before we kind of get started, I was wondering if you could give, for any listeners, a little bit of background on yourself. Where have you come from and how did you get to Edinburgh?
Sure. Well, it's a long story. I'll try to cut it short. So, first of all, I was born in Turin, in Italy. But soon after my secondary school, I left my hometown, and I moved to another city called Urbino, which is a walled city, but it's also hosting one of the oldest universities. In fact, it was founded in 1506. And that's where I actually had my second. I moved from the University of Turin to the University of Urbino, and I started studying Italian studies because at the time I had three main passions. One was literature, the other one was history, and then I had a passion for media. But Italian university programs did not allow to combine or integrate these kind of subjects. So we're talking about a few years ago. So basically, I studied a regular degree in Italian studies, which was mainly literary based, but also I attended extra courses in media and cultural studies from another degree program. Soon after my degree, I actually got a fellowship to study and to work as a language assistant at the University of Exeter. And that's when I basically arrived in the UK. It was not my first time, but it's when I started collaborating with Italian departments in the UK. And there was something about British university that fascinated me, or maybe because I was reading at the time. Remember, I was reading David Lodge's campus novels, which I found highly hilarious. Basically steered another passion of mine, the passion for teaching and research. And that's where I decided to become an academic and start a PhD. Mm-hmm. So I started a PhD in Italian studies at the University of Birmingham, after that year the University of Exeter. But my academic path has not been straightforward at all because for 10-15 years I lived between the two countries, Italy and the UK. So I went back to Italy for a few years. I worked as a linguist in different universities. And then I came back to London basically to take up a senior appointment, Institute of Modern Languages Research at the School of Advanced Study, where I was also directing cultural memory, the Institute of Modern Languages Research. And I was a senior lecturer of Italian. After that, I got a senior research fellowship as part of an HRC-funded project titled Interdisciplinary Italy, Interart, Intermedia, 1900-2020, which was basically, it was a collaborative project together with other colleagues from UCL, Royal Holloway, and the Trinity College Dublin. It was initially based at the University of Birmingham. And that project, in fact, was exploring the relationship between arts and media from 1900 to 2020. And it was for the first time that I actually felt kind of at home because it was combining my research interest in literary and media studies, also with an historical perspective. So basically, after that senior research fellowship, I joined the University of Edinburgh in 2021 last year. And basically this is, to cut the long story short, that's how I arrived here. And I could probably say that if there is a pattern in my research and in my interest, that's probably the idea of representation. So I'm interested in that from both the literary and media perspective. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot in the last few days.
I mean, it's really inspirational to hear that, because as a PhD student myself now, I'm at this point where I do have all these competing interests, like you were saying. And if you don't see the path, to know that you kind of kept going at it and then made the path that you're not seeing necessarily laid out immediately is very inspirational. And especially, like you were saying, you were going between Italy and the UK during that time. Did you find that there was like a big difference between how you were feeling working in the UK and working in Italy?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, they are two different educational system, and especially for career paths. If you have postgraduate studies in one country, it makes more sense and it's easier to continue in the same country for various reasons. First of all, because after 2008, many jobs in modern languages were cut. So I think it's better to stay with your own team or in one place and try to build upon that. So it's probably counterproductive if you move too much between places. But I would say yes. I mean, I think I'm a typical example of a historical trajectory where disciplines were first separated, and therefore it was very difficult for me to be placed in one area where I felt comfortable. And now, luckily, because they've been integrated, because there is more interdisciplinarity, I can find my space, I can find my place. In Italy, this is still not the case. So if I wanted to, for example, to become a lecturer or a professor in Italy, I would still need to choose one specific disciplinary area. Which would make it very complicated for my CV, for example. Yeah,
and I think when you were saying that you really care about representation, I feel like it's so much more authentic to the idea of representation to be able to span many different disciplines. So it must feel quite reductive to what your goals are in research to have to choose one area and just settle in. That's really interesting. And I guess to kind of get into your research, and before we launch in too much, I know that a lot of your work features Pier Paolo Pasolini. Could you tell us just a little bit of background about him and his work and how it maintains its relevance today in academia and just in cultural relevance?
Absolutely. So, Pasolini was one of the key intellectual figures of 20th century Italy, for various reasons, which I'm going to explain. But basically, he was born in 1922 in Bologna. He was a poet, he was a novelist, he was a film director, he was a playwright, a columnist, and also a painter.
Wow.
So, a truly interdisciplinary profile.
Talking about, many different fields.
Exactly. So, but I think I found out that he stood out in modern Italy for various reasons. First of all, because he was one of the most polemical and critical voices of the shift Italy went through in the 1950s from an mainly agricultural country to industrial and also, as Pasolini described it, a neo-capitalist society. Which was it was in the years 1958, 1963. That's the so-called Italian economical miracle that transformed Italy dramatically and quite in an extreme way, because basically it was the time when consumerism, mass media society took over, and it was such an abrupt change in Italy. And Pasolini was definitely against that for various reasons. One of them was that basically through mass media and this kind of communication that was mainly hierarchical and top-down, Italy was experiencing for the very first time linguistic and cultural unification. Because Italy is a relatively new country. It was unified in 1861, and so 1 century later, let's say, there was still a lot of diversity, cultural diversity. But when this economical transformation happened, that kind of standardized Italy in a quite a dramatic way. So Pasolini was very polemical against that. The other reason why he stood out was he was very interested in dialects. So he started writing his poetry in Friulan, in a local version of Friulan, and also his first 2 novels, the so-called Roman novels, were very much integrated with Roman dialect. Again, the reason why he saw dialects as such an important feature of his writing is because he was giving voice to linguistic and cultural diversity. So there was a really big component in his writing and in his way of defending Italian differences. That was another main feature that accompanied his career. But then towards the end of 1950s, Pasolini decided to move from literature to cinema. So there was a big shift there. It would be interesting to go into analyze it, but I'll try to cut it short. So he decided to move to the language of cinema, first of all because it was a more international language, easy to understand, even if you don't understand the actual verbal or dialogues, but it can be a language that can talk to more people. But after an initial phase of his cinema, the so-called national popular phase, which was a sort of extension of his Roman novels, so there were still the same themes, same topics, same characters somehow, he actually started a very long series of adaptations of classics. So some of his films in the second half of the 1960s were adaptations of Boccaccio's Decameron, Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, the Arabian Nights, and then the classical Greeks, so Medea, Oedipus Rex. And there was this really intense engagement with classics, in fact, where he was bringing, however, a lot of contemporary themes into this reconsideration of classics. So there was another important aspect that made him become a really international author and especially an international filmmaker. The other reason why Pasolini has become a key figure of Italian culture in 20th century and beyond is because he had a tragic death. He was basically murdered in 1975 near Rome. So there were a lot of speculations of whether this murder was he was basically murdered by a male prostitute, a male prostitute, because that's what he also used to do in some of his nights in this phase of his life. But there were also speculations of whether that was in fact a conspiracy, a political conspiracy against him, because during the last few years of his life, he had become particularly interested in all the political scandals affecting Italy, and he started writing what is his latest kind of novel, published posthumously in 1982, Petrolio, which looks at a lot of controversial aspects of Italian politics. So there is this kind of mystery around his life and career.
So it sounds like he was shaking the boat a little bit by the end, and throughout his career questioning the way and the direction that Italy was going at the time.
Exactly.
And I know that was part of the topic for the recent series of events that you organized about his life. It's basically his 100th anniversary now, isn't it? So what inspired you to organize this series? And could you tell us a little bit about the events that took place during it?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I was mentioning before some of the aspects that made him a very popular figure when he was alive during his career. Yeah. But now he has become, I think he has become even more relevant, to be honest, in the sense that he, for example, is an excellent example of intermediality, something that a field that was not even taken into consideration in the 50s, 60s, 70s in the way we do now. So it's that's one of the most recent research directions on his work, which I think is still very productive, very relevant. Another one is his engagement with classics and a variety of international word figures in not only in literature but also in the arts. So the idea of this series was, first of all, my PhD thesis was on Pasolini and Dante, so on Pasolini's reception of Dante, and that set the ground for my interest in the relationship between Pasolini and other classics. And I just found out that in the last 10-15 years, more scholars have actually become interested in exploring Pasolini and other authors, for example, Pasolini and Pound and Ezra Pound, or Pasolini and Shakespeare, Pasolini and Andy Warhol. The reason for that is because Pasolini did engage with all these figures, either very intensively or extensively. With Dante, it was like a 15 years engagement in his writing. So that's an area that I think is still under-researched, or it has become more emergent in the last 10-15 years. So there was a great occasion to dedicate a series. This series was basically the series I organized last year was a series of distinguished lectures, mainly from experts who explored the segments of these relationships of Pasolini and another classic. And I think that has been extraordinary in revealing aspects of Pasolini's work that are, as I said, either under-researched or would require more exploration. And another interesting, another reason why I decided to organize this series is I remember I was actually involved in the celebration of the 30th anniversary, the 40th anniversary of Pasolini in the last couple of decades. And I remember in 2005, so Pasolini's 30th anniversary, it was emerging is that Pasolini could not be a classic and could not be a model because he had actually challenged models, challenged the classics. So he didn't basically, some scholars thought he could not become like an author to be to create some, to be followed or to be an inspiration for others. And then 20 years later we could actually say exactly the opposite, because I think quite the contrary. I think what was difficult at the time was just to understand the breadth of Pasolini's experimentation and how he's in fact a really good model for, as I mentioned before, for example, for intermediality.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like this foray into valuing Pasolini is also just valuing subversive thought and that sort of blending of what we've thought of as this is a classic, this isn't, which is obviously so relevant in every sort of realm of academia today as we move towards decolonizing curriculums or whatever, to include more voices. And to see that in someone who has been previously discounted is really, really fascinating. And it also sounds so interesting that Pasolini is a specific person who opened himself up to dialogue, to be constantly brought into dialogue between eras and years and different times, and to see that being now valued and the way that he's being approached in study is really interesting. So kind of going on what you said, how your PhD was on Pasolini and Dante, who's also obviously a very influential figure in Italian culture. You traced how Dante's work has been influential on Italian literature and cinema, as well as on visual and performing arts. Have you found Dante's work reflected in modern Italian culture, and what does that tell us about the adaptation of classics across different forms of media?
Well, I'd say, first of all, the attitude towards classics has changed a lot in the last 50, 60 years. This is one of the reasons why Pasolini's work on Dante has been neglected for so many years, because Pasolini basically tried to rewrite the Commedia, Dante's Commedia, in a booklet that is fragmented, that is... It's basically a series of notes, and that was sent to the publisher. It was working on this for 15 years. Then it was sent to the publisher 3 weeks before he was killed. Oh, wow. But still, it is unfinished, and it doesn't seem to be. It has been for many years neglected by the criticism and in literary studies. And the reason also is that when Pasolini started. Reflecting about Dante when he was alive, Danteists were actually attacked him really fiercely.
Oh, wow.
Because there was a certain way you could approach classics like Dante, and a certain way, in many ways, you could not, or you wouldn't even be considered. So basically, when I started my PhD, of course, I started precisely from the studies on Pasolini and Dante that had been conducted before, and there was a lot of underestimation of this work, and also a long tradition of criticism where that was so limited in the sense of the spectrum of the phenomena that they were observing, that it could not, in fact, take into consideration the richness and the originality of some works of rewriting. So Dante clearly has been and is still a point of reference. It's an iconic figure in Italian culture, primarily also because it's taught in every school, and we learn it from the middle school on. So it's every Italian person knows about Dante. But then when it comes to so it has been also the subject of many writers in terms of quotations, in terms of references, in terms of the uses of some of his characters in their own works, and also there are some rewritings. Mm-hmm. But the field before, I would say before probably the last 10, 15 years, or maybe, 20 years, let's say 20, 25 years, there was a very limited perspective on the use, on the appropriations. So, in fact, even the word appropriation was not used. There was a sense, the idea of reception. So, and the reception had some specific parameters. So I remember when I started my PhD, the popular field in Italian studies was the reception of Dante in 20th century, or the reception of Dante in 19th century, or 18th century. Now, then I think across the years, throughout the years, that concept of reception has been changed into the idea of appropriation, and with much more freedom, allowing much more freedom to the authors. Because otherwise, the idea of reception was like, okay, you need to look at how the model is present in other authors' work. While the idea of appropriation is that you can do whatever you want with, also in a critical way, or transforming it or parodying. So it's a much bigger spectrum. And then, of course, with the transmediality, with the new research trends, that is intermediality, transmediality, so the idea that a pattern can travel and can metamorphose, I think that has added a lot to the sense of how a classic can be still present and relevant in modern contemporary culture.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating when you were laying that out, the idea that something could be so iconic in culture and only have one way of commenting on it. It seems ridiculous when you really think about the fact that it's going to be received by a plethora of different groups, of different people. So to only be able to discuss it in one way seems so, again, reductive. But then this idea that you can open it up and allow, appropriating is really quite a good word for it, to use it in a way that is also adding to your voice rather than just saying like, this is the only way to engage with a certain work. Obviously, when Dante was around, there wasn't anything like cinema or the internet or anything like that. So the way that it's being used is already not going to be the same way that it was intended to be consumed. So you state that a lot of your research on the interactions between medieval and modern culture focuses on the question as well of otherness. And I think this has come up already a lot, where you're saying about there's the one way, and then I guess everything else all of a sudden becomes the other, right? So what are some of these questions that you've been finding around otherness, and what do the interactions between the two time periods, maybe the one that Pasolini's in and the one that Dante is writing in, kind of reveal to us about the concept of the other?
Yes, well, I think everything again started with my PhD research. Pasolini was an excellent case study to see how the idea of otherness could, from medieval time, could become relevant in modernity, in Italian modernity. So. Basically, that was the first time when I kind of looked at medieval times from a contemporary modernity or contemporary perspective, and I think this is actually an interesting gaze on medieval times, because of course we can look at medieval and Renaissance times as medievalists, as Renaissance scholars. Which is not how I started. I started as a 20th century scholar. And in that sense, we basically bring a different approach to the subject, because we really want to see the relevance, also the forms of appropriation, forms of ways of traveling, how motifs or themes travel across centuries and across cultures. So the idea of otherness was something that Pasolini was strongly interested in, because when he looked at Dante, he wanted to find a sense of realism in a model. He was searching for a model of realism that could give voice to otherness, especially linguistically. And in fact, so that's where I started. Now, at the moment, I'm actually interested. Dante, for example, can be very interesting for explore the concept of otherness from other angles. I'm currently teaching a course to first-year students where we look at various categories of otherness, religious otherness, so Muslim, Jews in the Divine Comedy, or even exotic otherness. We look at Marco Polo's The Travels and how he encountered the Mongols. So that's still medieval time. Or we look at that, or the figure of gender figures and how they were others at the time. So That's something I'm very interested in. Bringing also contemporary questions to explore text, not just to criticize how these authors wrote, because of course that was part of the context, and that's what is interesting, but seeing how forms of otherness emerged and identities were formed, and therefore creating a sense of othering, basically.
Is this class that you're teaching, is it to undergrads right now?
Yes, absolutely. It's a first-year course.
Oh, it's a first year. Okay, so this is always really interesting to me, because even though I'd like to think I'm not too far away from being an undergrad, I still feel like every time I go into a class, their perspective on things is always so different, just because of how much more otherness has been part of the conversation. So are you finding them having pretty interesting perspectives on Pasolini and Dante and this classics realm?
Yeah, well, I don't teach Pasolini to first years, but I teach. We analyze a few texts from medieval times, and the Renaissance time as well. So this is a module that is part of the Italian studies, Italian cultural studies. So we look at Dante's Inferno, but also Boccaccio's Decameron. When we analyze a female figure, one of the novellas centered around the figure of Griselda, which is a patient Griselda is a well-known figure. Also, it has been appropriated by other authors. So I find I was very struck, and I'm still always impressed. This is the second year I teach this course. I've just finished, and I'm actually marking the essays by now. I'm really impressed by the perception and the level of analysis that first year students can bring to this text, even if they don't know the entire Divine Comedy or they don't know the entire Decameron. Of course, Dante, because they can select, Dante's Inferno is usually a more challenging text, because they realize that they need more background in terms of Christianity, understanding the biblical references and so on. But I have to say, I read some really interesting and insightful essays, because clearly this idea of otherness is very familiar, is part of contemporary debates. So they can bring it to this text and come up with very original comments and ideas.
You've mentioned this term a couple times, and I wanted to kind of go back to it, where you say in some of your works that Pasolini is appropriating Dante's realism, and you said something about he's interested in the concept of realism. Could you maybe just explain a little bit more what is meant by realism in this sense, and how can we best kind of understand this concept here?
Yeah, so basically, when Pasolini started exploring Dante's work in particular, we were in the it was 1950s, and in the 1950s in Italy, but also in other European countries, the intellectual debates revolved very much around the question of realism, especially in left-wing Marxist circles. And this was due to the fact that after the Second World War, and there was a sense of giving voice to the common people, to lower classes as well. There was a sense of rebuilding the countries after the destruction, but also there was also a sense of giving voice to an ideology that was more related to real life experiences rather than idealizing, because there was the heritage from right-wing extreme ideologies that brought to Nazism and fascism. In Italy, that one of the most obvious phenomenon is neorealism in cinema. And then many writers were inspired by Lukács' realism, so the ideas of realism that were circulating at the time. This was a model that was especially common and circulating in the intellectual circles of the Italian Communist Party. Pasolini was, in fact, he was a Marxist, but he was expelled from the Italian Communist Party because of he was gay, he was openly gay, and he was found in a sentimental, romantic, and sexual encounter with a boy, so he was expelled from the party. Has always since then had a very conflicting relationship with the party. But basically, when Pasolini decided to start his first novels, these Roman novels, and these debates were circulating, he was looking for a model of realism which was more linguistic rather than, representing characters or... So at the time, he was very close to a literary critic and philologist named Gianfranco Contini, who had popularized among circles of intellectual a juxtaposition between Dante and Petrarch, where Dante was a symbol of plurilingualism. And this plurilingualism had become a sort of a synonym of realism in an interesting way, while Petrarch was more using a language in a more absolute, pure, selective way. So Dante had become the poet of reality in these kind of environments, in this kind of vulgarization. So why was it a poet of reality? Because it was using the language in a way that was naming a more diverse reality. And also in the Inferno, we have a huge variety of very intense and expressive descriptions of characters, of humanity also in all the different aspects. So Pasolini, because that kind of critical model of associating plurilingualism with realism, that's how Pasolini created his model of realism from Dante. And he tried to replicate it in his Roman novels using the Roman dialect in the same way. So that's basically how Pasolini ideas of realism was taken from Dante. A few years later, when he decided to move to cinema, there was another model which became very influential in Pasolini's work. There was Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature. That was published in 1956. It was translated into Italian in 1957. So Pasolini read that book and was struck by the idea of, again, realism that Auerbach was conveying about Dante, but there was a different type of realism. It was figural realism, and it is that model of figural realism, or also it was also described as corporeal realism, that he got inspiration for his cinema. So it's interesting that Dante was always there, basically reached Pasolini through two different literary critics. And one was used for the literary career, basically the novels, and the other one, Auerbach, was used for his cinema.
Oh, it's so interesting. And I love the idea that plurilingualism relates to realism. That's such a simple but very profound concept that, of course, the variation in voices, the variation in the way that we actually speak is so relevant to real life. And the ways that can be controlled when you don't have that variety and how that changes dialogue around it. That's really fascinating. That's really interesting. And then I guess, could you explain a little bit more about that figural realism, I think is what you said. Was that mainly using the body as a way to explore realism?
Basically what Pasolini was particularly interested in taking this model from Auerbach was the sense that in cinema he could build different layers because cinema is an intermedium, in fact, so you can helps you combine the moving body, music, painting through photography, through the framing. But so many other, you can associate a moving body with a statue and create meaning. So I think he had a lot of fun, and I found in this idea of figural realism. So the idea is that, for example, the sub-proletarians in his films are usually associated, especially in this first phase of his cinema, with the figure of Christ. So how could you create that? He created this association. To understand this kind of method, you basically, we need to go back to Auerbach's idea of figural realism, where one character is kind of anticipating or a certain destiny, so it's an idea. There is a sense that basically a character is figural in the sense that is representing something that is happening in a second moment. So Pasolini was doing that in a really clever, original way by combining, for example, his characters with a certain music or with a certain very famous paintings, and creating these associations. It was building his cinema by putting together different signs, we would say today, drawing thinking of Stuart Hall and the idea of a sign to build reality. So it was putting together different signs, overimposing, let's say, creating a layered reality. And in that way, it was creating a very rich meaning.
I think that's so interesting to say that a figure or something that you've seen is anticipating a future one, because that is allowing Pasolini, I guess, to build himself into that dialogue and to make himself relevant. I guess, again, that term appropriating those previously images and then showing that he's still part of the discussion now and that maybe was anticipating him, and then that layering. This is, again, making me really want to watch one of his films. I guess really quickly, for anyone who maybe hasn't seen a Pasolini film or read his works, would you give like a quick recommendation of which ones you think are good starters?
Oh, it's difficult. It's difficult because well, it depends on what you're interested in. If you're interested more into this kind of a national popular phase, you can then watch the first movies from Accattone, which was his first one, 1961, and then Mamma Roma, again part of this with Anna Magnani, an iconic figure of Italian neorealism. This was filmed in 1962, and then there is a short film, La Ricotta, which was part of a collective movie, and then, of course, The Gospel According to Matthew, which was a very well recognized movie, also from the Catholic Church, which hasn't always been in line with Pasolini's thoughts, as you can imagine. So that phase is more about the figure of Christ and the subproletarian. So the association of the lower classes, the weaker, the margins of societies associated with the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and so on. If you're more interested in the adaptation of classics, then of course it starts from the Decameron or the Canterbury Tales, or Theorem is an interesting one. It's not an adaptation. I mean, it's an adaptation of his own book, Theorem, and this has been it's a theme that has been replicated in other films by other directors. But basically, it's the idea that in a bourgeois family, a visitor, a guest, comes from nowhere. We don't know where it's come from, out of the blue, let's say, and he disrupts the kind of the relationships and the dynamics and the logics and the structure of this family. So, of course, it's a criticism against that kind of class at the time. But there's also this idea of a guest that stays with his family for some time and disrupts the dynamics of this family and the individual identity of each of them. I have a favorite. My favorite film is actually not a film; it's like a short film.
Yeah,
it's called "Che cosa sono le nuvole," which means what are clouds, and it's an adaptation of Shakespeare's Othello.
Oh, interesting.
And it's why I like it is because it's about representation.
Yes.
It's actually probably the most significant film, but in general text that Pasolini produced about the concept of representation. So I would recommend that one, but I understand it's not a straightforward reading, but that it's a reflection on cinema, theater, representation. And it's also a reflection about different genres because it starts from a classic, Shakespeare's Othello, but then it's set in a puppet. It uses basically characters who are acting as puppets.
Oh, interesting.
And then it's in a popular cinema, like let's say in a small town cinema. So it's set in a small town cinema. It uses Velázquez's Las Meninas as a key point, an interpreting key, let's say, to understand the film. And in fact, you have it as a poster of the film. So he's leaving little hints here and there. It's like a very enigmatic, I think, short film, which I love precisely because I think it's a kind of manifest of Pasolini's representation.
So I'm definitely going to go see if I can try and find that somewhere.
It's on by Mio, yes.
Oh, is it? Okay, good. I'll put the link maybe when we put this episode up so people can find it. And how you were also saying, I think, when you were saying that there's the guest that comes and disrupts thing, again, kind of was making me think of that conversation about the other and what can the other do when it comes into established society or something like a family. So shifting a little bit, I know you also recently published a monograph titled Umberto Eco's Opera Aperta, Italian Electronic Literature from the 1960s to the Present, where you trace the convergence of electronic media and literary forms during the digital revolution. In this text, you argue that Umberto Eco's Opera Aperta, and sorry if I'm not pronouncing these things that well.
It's perfect. It's perfect. Well done.
Provides a theoretical and methodological framework to analyze Italian electronic literature across decades from both an aesthetic and critical perspective. That sounds so interesting. Could you give us a bit of insight into the connection between Eco's work and this framework for e-lit, and also maybe give a little definition of what electronic literature is?
Yeah, well, as we're now moving into the other strand of my research. Basically, although Pasolini and Umberto Eco were contemporary, they were living at the same time, but it's interesting how sometimes they also argued. I remember there was an article of Umberto Eco attacked Pasolini on his theory of cinema. So it's interesting. Okay, so in 1962, Umberto Eco published a volume titled Opera Aperta. So that's, in fact, his title. I appropriated for mine.
Following in line, exactly. That sounds great, yeah.
And that's the first, I would say, it's a seminal theoretical text about experimentation in the avant-garde. So we, at the same time, while there were authors like Pasolini doing these kind of things we've just discussed, there were like other authors who experimented more with the form, with language. This is basically the Italian neo-avant-garde and new avant-garde, which was second wave from after the historical avant-garde, surrealism, futurism, and so on. So we are in the 1960s. And Umberto Eco theorized this idea of opera aperta. Opera aperta, which we can translate as open text, open work, basically is an idea that kind of try to challenge not challenge, but is juxtaposed to the idea of a closed text. The idea, basically, Umberto Eco starts from the assumption that in the past, as previous centuries, but without a continuity, there was more the sense of a cosmos, something that was all organized. We had an idea of how everything was in place and encyclopedic in a certain way. And literary work somehow reflected that. So the author was giving, not only they were providing closed, finished works, they were also saying, suggesting how we should read them. And that kind of reflected this idea of cosmos. According to Umberto Eco, in the 1960s and before as well, this idea of cosmos was now replaced by the idea of chaos. Modernity brings chaos, brings various perspectives, multitude of forms. And so Opera Aperta has three main ways of understanding opening. So first of all, it's can be considered as an unfinished work in the sense that the reader can interpret the work, so can bring his own understanding. Opera Aperta was setting the ground for Umberto Eco's later work on the reader. Umberto Eco was one of the main theorists of reception theory. So the first understanding of opening is the sense that the readers can even change the meaning of a text while they're reading it. But in that particular period, so the 1960s, works of art were also intentionally left open. So one of the examples that Umberto Eco brings up is Dante. Dante's Commedia has 4 levels of interpretation as suggested by Dante: the literal, the allegorical, and so on. But still, there are some ways, a set of ways that Dante gave us to read the text. In the 1960s, so in modernity, authors at the time were even leaving their work unfinished, so that it could either be completed by other artists or as a sort of co-production, and this is typical of the avant-garde movements, or it could be completed by readers. So that's one meaning. The other meaning is the sense of opening as a kind of the text is open to a contamination, or let's say intersection between arts and media. So it allows, it implicitly kind of anticipates the concept of intermediality. So there were Higgins at the time, 1966, he came out with his book Intermedia, and he was theorizing that. Umberto Eco was not talking about it explicitly, but there is much about the idea of intermediality in his theorization of opera aperta. And the third way of being open for a text is that at the time, writers or also other artists were very interested in the opening of a text towards other disciplines, the sciences, social sciences, psychoanalysis, and bringing this knowledge into the literary works. So we're talking about interdisciplinarity, basically. So these three levels of opening, reception, intermediality, interdisciplinarity, I thought they were really good methodological tool to understand not only the early examples and experiments of electronic literature, but also the entire, in fact, most of the examples that have come after that. The reason why I took this work, I adopted this approach for my as a methodological and theoretical framework is because, in fact, Opera Aperta was the milestone. It started the phenomenon of neo-avant-garde in Italy, and in some of the examples, some of the case studies of the experiments were in electronic literature. So they were working in the same kind of group of people. So it was totally appropriate to use it for the case studies of the 1960s, which was in fact only one, Nanni Balestrini, Tape Mark 1, which was one of the very first examples of electronic literature in the world. It was a computer poem. So a poem generated through a mainframe. At the time we didn't have like laptops, but it was like a calculator, a machine. And that was one of the very first really cutting edge and totally pioneering the field. And he was an Italian, Nanni Balestrini, one of the key figures of Italian neo-avanguardia. But then after, of course, there were many cases until the 1990s because computers were not available to anyone. Yeah. So there were collaborations between some artists and some IT specialists, but there were not many. 1990s, the network, the World Wide Web, so that became more of everyone could access these tools. But still, these three principles associated with Opera Aperta, for me, were actually guiding the research of all the case studies that followed. If you think about how most of electronic literature, and I'm going to now to give a definition, but basically some of the works are planned, designed to be completed by the users. So this sense of opening is totally appropriate, totally in line with to explore this kind of experiments. So what is electronic literature? Electronic literature is according to the Electronic Literature Organization.
Yes. Good source, yeah.
It's a really general term definition. They say it's any kind of work that uses that takes basically literary forms and makes use of computers in any form, in any kind. So it could be computer poem as a poem generated by a calculator, by a computer. It could be a wiki, a novel written by multiple authors across the world by using a wiki platform. It could be video, so it could be like any kind of video poem. So mainly, anytime that there is some sort of poeticity, though, some elements of literarity or literary forms, then we can talk about electronic literature. So the main genres that I have analyzed in my book are computer poetry, video poetry, net poetry, collective novels written through various platforms, blogs, and so it's a really broad range of applications, broad range of forms, or blooks. Blooks are basically books that originally were born as blogs.
Oh wow!
So they had in the formation, in their genesis, they were making use of the blog.
Yeah.
But then the final outcome was a book. So these are all examples of electronic literature, basically.
I think that's so interesting. And you're saying blogs that turn into books. And one thing that kind of struck me when you said that is the fact that blogs have comments, and that is where that there's the opportunity for the readers to actively form and change and be in dialogue. In maybe a sillier realm, but it also made me think, obviously, of fan fiction, which is such an internet phenomenon. Well, I mean, at least it seems to be, right? And that is kind of, in whatever way it turns out, however the quality is, it reminds me so much of what we've kind of been discussing, in that sense that there are often these people who maybe are not in the common mind, the ideal figure to interpret and read and change it, but who are interpreting and reading and changing these sort of canon works. And often I find that, like, when I hear people, I'm not a huge consumer, I don't really read fan fiction, but it sounds like often what happens is they take what's the known situation and then they add maybe the other that comes in and disturbs what has been introduced in those other texts. And then another kind of thing, it seems like there's so much wealth to go into with this, but it also made me think of what's kind of recently being talked about a lot with, like, AI produced like fiction, and how people can put in input and then the computer completes it. So it sounds like there's a lot of interesting ways for this to continue to develop. And again, now another thing I need to do is go and read this book. So it's your book. It sounds so great. Okay, I won't keep you around too much longer, but I'll ask the question that I always like to end the podcast with. I know you've only been here for about a year, and it's been still the remnants of a pandemic. So even if it's like your favorite coffee shop or your favorite chair that you like to sit in when you read a book, where has been your favorite place in Scotland and why?
Yeah, well, I would say in Edinburgh, because unfortunately I haven't had the chance. I don't have a car, so I haven't had the chance to travel very much. I had, of course, a few excursions here and there, but this is my plan. It's something I like to do more. In Edinburgh, I have two favorite places. One is the Meadows, which I love.
The Meadows are beautiful.
It's the place where it's basically, I cross the Meadows every single day when I come to work, because I live on the other side. And I think I literally every day I take pictures.
Yes.
Just to document the change of seasons and the trees and the various, I love it. It's a really wonderful park. I don't know, there's something about it that makes it a really unique park in my experience. The other place I like is Carton Hill. I find it a meditative place, so I don't go there as often because it's a bit farther, but I like the view. I like there is something about the Greek rests and the space in general. It's a place where I really bring when I have guests, I bring them there, and it's a really wonderful place as well. So I would say these are the two places I like the most.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, Carlton Hill, because someone told me, I don't know if this is true, and I'll have to look this up, but that, like, obviously those structures that me, as well as someone who's moved here, thought of such an iconic part of Edinburgh, and I think a lot of tourists go up to and really fall in love with, was originally thought of as like Scotland's shame, because they were meant to finish it,
that's
right?
Yes.
And I kind of feel like that's a really good place to kind of wrap up how time and input from other voices can change the way that we view a place, right? Because now it's definitely a beautiful and iconic place to visit. So yeah, I guess that will be a place where we can kind of wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it has been really a pleasure.
It's been fascinating.
It made me think about so many aspects of my research that I haven't thought about for months now, for a year. So thank you to give me the opportunity to think about it.
Yeah, well, thank you for talking us through it and for hopefully introducing a lot of new people to these concepts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna.
Beyond the Books is a podcast from the University of Edinburgh's School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures. I'm Emma Aviet. Thank you so much for listening.